Good morning and welcome to our HIV Prevention and Education Virtual Summit presentation entitled Emerging Priorities in Cure Research. Today we are joined by research collaborators from FIGHT, Wistar, and UPenn. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few reminders. Viewers, please make sure your mics are muted. The chat box is disabled, but you can ask questions using the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. Remember, this presentation is being recorded. Q&A will take place at the end of the presentation. At this time, I will turn it over to our panelists so that we can begin the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning. So thank you for joining us. Hi, Pablo. So let me get my slide up. Just give me 1 second while I do that. And then I need to share the whole Zoom sequence here.
Yeah, we have been doing this for 2 years and a half, and we still trying difficulty finding the mute button.
There you go. So welcome everyone. So it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion. So we basically want to have a brief overview of what are the emerging questions in the cure-directed research effort. We're going to hear from myself, overview of what our current activities are with respect to the Beat HIV program. You'll hear from Dr. Tebas on the ACTG and the current studies that are available. You'll then hear from Mr. Ken Lin, who will sort of give you a perspective from being responsible for clinical operations and participants that contribute to the different studies. And then you'll hear from Ms. Danielle Campbell, who will also share some insights on the importance of participation and community representation and women in cure-related studies. So I know some of you may watch this at a future time, so hopefully this will give you an overview of what's happening in 2022. So again, I'm going to just, in my part of the discussion, I'm going to focus on the HIV cure-directed program under the auspices of the Beat HIV program, sharing with you some research highlights as well as community engagement activities. So the Beat HIV program is one of several in a network of investigators nationally that is currently in the second of a 5-year cycle. And we're part of a larger community of investigators that are addressing similar questions to the ones we're going to be discussing, because all of these groups really have a common objective of trying to understand what are the factors that can regulate the HIV reservoir and how to best go after it and control it. But most importantly, we are all trying to develop new strategies to either control virus without rebound, which means that you could stop antiretroviral therapy and the virus would not return as measured in the blood, or ideally really achieve something beyond control, which is really a reduction of the reservoir, which would be the path towards eradication. And lastly, all of these programs include a community engagement component that's very important to bringing all the participants and people that want to support this work moving forward together. And for us in Philadelphia, we're uniquely suited in that we have a wonderful social science agenda that is which is part of our objectives, and we'll briefly touch on that. I think another way to look at our objectives is through this cartoon, which has been very useful in trying to show again where can we find the virus, how to strengthen the immune system, or how to empower the immune system to really go out and kill the cells that are bearing HIV infection so that the entire system could be eradicated from the infection. So what are some of the questions that we are still addressing? And it's interesting that we're still trying to understand and intercede in what were really the original observations of the persistence of HIV after individuals start antiretroviral therapy. Since 1997, we've known that individuals can suppress their viral replication, but the amount of virus that one could measure remains relatively stable thereafter. And this has obviously presented the need for daily therapy and the inability to cure from HIV infection. And we refer to this persistence of HIV as a reservoir, or the amount that remains able to persist in an individual. And within that concept of persistence, you have the expectation that cells, when they are infected by HIV, they will express viral particles and they will be more sensitive to die thereafter, that this process of viral production will place the cell in more of a precarious state and therefore more likely to be depleted. And that's, for example, one of the simplest explanations for the drop in CD4 count, that we think that the CD4 count is really a reflection of this progressive loss of cells. Now, when it comes to the persistence issue as to why does HIV persist in an individual, the concept that has emerged is that infected cells can also persist in what we refer to as a resting state, which is really a term meant to indicate that a cell cannot make viral particles, but have the potential to make viral particles. And that this resting state is almost like a quiet phase or a phase of not having any viral proteins expressed. So it could also be more likely to evade immune clearance because of its lack of expressing any viral particles at that time. However, upon stimulation or upon a process of reactivation in the future, this cell could then initiate viral production. And we've studied across multiple teams what is driving this cell to persist. And we've learned, like, for example, that the CD4 cells could include a component of cells that are of this type. We also have learned that early after infection, this type of cell is already present upon infection. So it's not something that emerges over time. It's actually there from the beginning. And we also know that the earlier somebody starts antiretroviral therapy after infection, the smaller the number of these cells are, to suggest that over time, the number of cells that could acquire this property increases in individuals that are long-term living with HIV without antiretroviral therapy, that this amount of cells will be larger once they do start antiretroviral therapy. And obviously, as we already noted, that they can persist indefinitely in spite of having successfully suppressed viral replication. Now, we also know that the cell resides in multiple organs throughout the body, that it is not only present in the blood. And when we think about cure-directed strategies and how to eradicate HIV from an individual, although we study the blood as the most accessible, specimen we can collect, we know that the virus can persist in multiple organs as well, so that we have to learn what we can from the blood, but a lot of the cure-directed studies include treatment interruption sequences in them, because once you stop antiretroviral therapy, your entire system is now able to express the virus that it has potential to express, and it doesn't only come from the blood. And that's why treatment interruptions up until this point have been very definitive in giving us the ultimate summary of the entire system's ability to make or have cells make viral particles, regardless of whether it's in the blood or within a tissue. However, it would be beneficial for us to be able to understand what's happening within each one of these organ systems, so that, for example, we can access a rectal biopsy as something that could be done on as a participant, and it give us a window to a tissue that we can harvest safely. There are studies in California, for example, called the Last Gift program, where individuals that have a terminal disease are donating their bodies for analysis of HIV infection. And in these particular instances, then these teams have access to multiple tissues that could then be used to further understand the dynamics of the persistence of HIV. So regarding then what we're doing today with respect to the Beat HIV program, as I mentioned, one of the objectives is the mechanisms of persistence, or how the virus remains in an individual. And I think that this kind of list illustrates where the field is going. The top is really the total amount of HIV DNA that a person can sustain or be measured in the blood. And this was something that was our main window to the persistence of HIV about 6 or 7 years ago. Then came the advance of being able to identify of that total DNA, which component was intact. And this was, for example, in our previous cycle of the Beat HIV collaboratory, the ability to detect that 1% of the total DNA or less that is able to be intact became possible. So a lot of studies started to emphasize the measurements of intact over total. But I think now what we're learning as we further understand this 1% is that this 1% could actually be divided even further into those intact copies that are within regions that could be read in the genome. We refer to them as genomic regions, or those intact copies that could be present in genomic regions, but they can be actively repressed or shut down by other mechanisms. And as we talked, tissues may be another component in this dynamic of repression or genomic versus non-genomic distribution. And we also want to understand how the immune system can interface with this dynamic to hopefully have an immune response that could find genomic intact HIV and delete it, and us to find strategies by which we can basically remove repression from what is present in order to go after it or have the immune system go after it. So this research continues, and I think that we're progressing even further to understand the anatomy or the composition of the reservoir in a way that will make strategies that much more efficient moving forward. But of course, we want to understand, even within the context of infection, why does the immune system not clear an infection when it's present in its full bloom or its full form? And I think we've already known that the virus can mutate or persist and kind of evade immune clearance by the nature of its ability to evolve and mutate continuously. But I want to highlight at least one collaborative work that came from the group this year in trying to present another mechanism by which persistence could be present. And this work really highlights the fact that our immune systems have this group of cells called cytotoxic T cells, which are actually empowered to go and kill cells that are infected in our body. And they can include HIV-infected cells as well as other viruses or bacteria. And that's great because we benefit from that response greatly, and we look for this response to help us clear HIV-infected cells in the body. But one of the reasons that these particular type of cell doesn't get affected by the same mechanism that it can kill other cells is that it carries a protein called serpin B9. And this acts almost like an internal protective shield for the CD8 T cell so that it itself is not subject to the detrimental effects of granzyme B. The problem arises in that the CD4 cell can also develop into a cytotoxic phenotype with the same killer potential and the same protective coating. And the reason that's a problem is that in the context of an immune response, when the CD4 killer cell is expanding in order to respond to an infection, it may also then produce viral particles because it's also able to be infected. And when the CD8 cells find out about this and try to contain it, they can't, because the same mechanism that they're using to kill it, the CD4 is already have it in order to protect itself from clearance. And this creates then a process by which you have a component of your CD4 cells expanding, able to be infected and produce viruses, but unable to be cleared from one of the main responses that we look for clearance. So this, obviously, now that it's been identified, gives us an opportunity to design strategies to break this cycle. So I think from that perspective, it's good news that we know now that this could be a mechanism of persistence. So the other area that we're very interested in is determining what determines the amount of virus that an individual will have after they stop antiretroviral therapy. And it seems relatively simple to think that you stop antiretroviral therapy and the virus is just coming back. But we now know that this line really is a summary of multiple components that are happening at the same time. We know that there are dynamics of the immune response that are contributing for how long it takes for the virus to emerge and how high. We know that there are components of what we refer to as an innate immune system, or your basic immune components that determining what type of virus comes out. And we just discussed how an immune response that you may be having against another infection may actually contribute to the production of virus on its own right. And most recently, we've identified in the team a lot of other new parameters that were unknown before that potentially are related to the amount of virus that returns. And the benefit of these is that because they're soluble and they're present in the blood, perhaps they could be exploited therapeutically as well. And I think that this research continues. Now, from the point of view of strategies for control, I think that our group has a particular benefit of currently trying to explore up to 6 different strategies that are under development for the control of HIV after stopping antiretroviral therapy. And we all know that it's a little bit of a slippery slope, because control versus eradication is a little bit of a gray line, because obviously something that controls may actually have a potential to also contribute to a reduction. But we are starting from the goal of control with the knowledge that these strategies could also move into eradication. And you're seeing a lot of cartoons here, and it's pretty much to remind me to tell you about the different strategies that we're taking, because I know that we don't have time to go through these in detail, but just know that a lot of the strategies that we're trying to develop are based on exploiting existing immune mechanisms that are present in individuals on antiretroviral therapy by giving the immune system tools that it naturally does not have, but imparting these could result in a very successful detection and killing of infected cells in the body. And this has been taken, this approach has been taken by multiple different ways, with the hope that at least one of them is successful. Now, one of the areas that has been the most advanced clinically is this notion of using antibodies to control viral replication. And this comes from the knowledge that this cartoon that you see here, which is really the outside of the HIV virus, highlighting one component of their membrane called the envelope protein, has a lot of different regions that we know can be targeted by antibodies, which are things that we naturally produce, but the individuals from which the antibodies that we use clinically came from were uniquely identified because they were able to bind to the envelope of multiple individuals. And this is why they call broadly neutralizing, because they can actually neutralize many different viral particles coming from multiple different individuals. And there are two of them that have been recently now shown this year in April to be able to sustain viral suppression in spite of stopping antiretroviral therapy. And the data shows that when individuals stop antiretroviral therapy, they can continue to receive the antibodies and their virus remains suppressed. So we in the collaboratory here have extended this study by including an immune modulating agent that is expected to also provide an antiviral contribution. And the question for us is, what could be expected if we add on to the suppression a potential mechanism that could further limit viral replication through a different mechanism? And I think that this data is now being analyzed, but we have been able to confirm that in individuals during what we refer to as step 3, which is immunotherapy, that as the parent study already showed, if we focus on the time that they stopped antiretroviral therapy and were receiving the antibodies, these individuals were able to, in the red line, not have viral rebound in almost 83% of individuals. And this, from one side, confirms data coming from the New York study that I just told you about earlier this year, and gives a lot of hope that these antibody strategies could potentially control viral replication. Now, for us, the question is, what is happening to the reservoir in the individuals in our study, because we have an additional immune modulator on board, and also what's happening when individuals stop their immunotherapy over time, and what may be outcomes that could be associated with this strategy. And that's work that is currently ongoing. Now, with respect to strategies of eradication, there are two things to highlight. One is the continued development of strategies that empower T cells to kill HIV-infected cells through immunotherapy. And the immunotherapy is basically giving killer cells the ability to target the interaction between CD4 and the viral envelope. And the way that we do that is by putting the CD4 molecule as almost like a finder of an HIV-infected cell in a killer cell that is able to kill with a higher level of potency than the natural cells that we have in our body. So gene therapy strategies empower the T cell to kill, give it the CD4 cell to find the viral infected envelope, and as a consequence is expected to provide a killing program over time to an individual. And this work, again, is underway. The second area is area of eradication. And here, one of the main objectives is to delete the CCR5, which is a second molecule required for viral entry, and the one that we know has been associated with the cure strategies that have been known to date, because bone marrow transplants with cells that lack this molecule can result in the cure of HIV. So the question is, absent a bone marrow transplant, can we go in and delete this molecule in individuals through multiple strategies that include technologies similar to the one being used for COVID vaccines? And this work, again, is addressing this question through multiple ways, and it will be of interest to determine, how this moves forward in the years to come. I think from the community, one of the things that's unique about Philadelphia is the ability to join multiple groups in what we refer to as a community engagement group, both the scientists, the CAB, or the voices of the community, and Philadelphia Fight as a community-based organization that has established links with the community. And this relationship has been very successful in generating videos that are available at our website that you can access, as well as a position paper on information that would be of use of anyone considering participating in a cure-directed study, including a Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. This year, we've put a lot of effort into understanding the at-home viral load measures that could be obtained through this device. And we've both undertaken a study to compare how well will it perform as viral load measures and how well could it be accepted by the community. And I think from the community perspective, both surveys of our users in Philadelphia, as well as national surveys, have been recently reported that, interestingly, one of the workshops at the prevention and at this session deals with the outcome of these two reports, and I would refer you to that, which has been recorded. You can find out more. This is part of a social science agenda for the group that is moving forward in multiple iterations. And one of the things that I want to make sure to invite you to is the Jonathan Lax Memorial Lecture, which is happening later this month on June 28th. And we have representation from multiple teams across the globe that are going to be joining in. And we also have a panel discussion on what the cure may mean to multiple different individuals, including individuals in the US as well as in Africa. So if you want to get involved, there are opportunities for providing specimens that we learned from in individuals on or off antiretroviral therapy. If you're a person living with HIV on medications of substance use disorder, like we also want to hear from you because we have an interest in understanding the impacts of these medications on the reservoir. And you can also join the Community Advisory Board and represent individuals like yourself. For that, I would refer you to Ken Lin, who's going to speak later in this program and who can intercede and put you in touch with the right group to participate in. With that, I will thank you and thank all the participants on the collaboratory and our funders, and we can proceed with Pablo's discussion. So Pablo?
Luis, are you going to take any questions before, or?
I didn't know if we would take I can take questions now. I figure we do all the clinical and then we'll take the questions thereafter, because I would expect a lot of the topics you'll cover are also gonna touch on the similar themes.
I hope you can see the screen. Let me put it in a slideshow. Which screen are you seeing?
We're seeing the one with the slide and the slides on the left-hand side.
Oh, I have to flip the.
Flip your monitor.
Yeah. Stop sharing. Stop video.
If you put a slideshow on the bottom, you're not going to get.
No, I get it in the other monitor. That's the problem.
Oh. I have to shift monitors.
Yeah, let me open here, but it will show up in the other one. Let me just share it from here. I don't know. Slideshow. Oh, you're seeing, yeah, let me just, you're seeing my,
Yep. We're seeing your slide. There you go. You're good. You're good to go.
You see it?
Yep, we see it in slide mode.
Okay.
Go for it.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the ACTG agenda, which is the AIDS Clinical Trial Group. We have several studies going up, and thank you, Luis, for all the introduction. So I had to talk less about the background and just show you the studies that are going to be opening, and some of them are already open to potential participants. And is getting into the same ideas that Luis has been talking about. This is the research agenda on the CURE TSG. This is the Transformative Science Group. They have these fancy names. That is part of the ACTG, the AIDS Clinical Trial Group, that is doing studies to try to understand better the reservoirs of HIV and then try to develop therapeutic interventions to either reduce the reservoir or allow for the eradication of HIV, and also to allow people to stop antiretroviral therapy and not having viral rebound. So that's the holy grail of cure, the cure agenda of ACTG. Is also the goal of the BEAT HIV Delaney collaboratory. So the goals are very similar. And then we want to engage community partners. The ACTG has a large group of community partners, and to clearly understand the ethical and the behavioral implications of these trials that many times include a treatment interruption that can put other people at risk. So we want to understand better how to do treatment interruptions and protect not only the participants in the trial, but try to decrease the risk for other people that the participant in the trial interacts with. So that's the kind of studies that we are doing and thinking about. So Luis talked about strategies to try to decrease the reservoir. And one of the strategies that we have been talking about for years is to try to kick the reservoir and then kill it. So this is a study that is already open, 5386, and is given three things. One is an IL-15 superagonist, N803. This is a product that, when studied, showed that is associated, the administration of this product, which is a subcutaneous injection, is associated with a blip of the viral load. And that's given in combination with two of the antibodies that Luis was talking about, two broadly neutralizing antibodies. So this is the kick, and this is the kill, the combination of broadly neutralizing antibodies. So people the participants at entry, they have to be, these are for people that have been suppressed for more than 96 weeks for 2 years. They have to have sensitive virus using the monogram assay. And that's one of the difficulties of this study, because many times people are infected with, they have an HIV virus. People are living with an HIV virus that has some resistance to these monoclonal antibodies. They have to have a sensitive virus before entering, and we give two different antibodies, BRCO7, which is a CD4 binding antibody in this fancy graph that Luis showed, and 1074, which is a B1 loop antibody. So at baseline, both groups, one group, so people are randomized to receive the antibodies in one arm in combination with N803, the kick. So, or just the kick alone. So the subcutaneous injection, you get it for 8 weeks. And the antibody, you get the antibodies at baseline and at week 24, one of them, because they have different half-lives. And we wait until everything goes out of your system. We wait almost for a year. So you get the injections of the kick and you get the antibodies at the same time. So the idea is that the kick will make the cells that are infected with HIV visible to the immune system, and we are giving the antibodies so they can be bind to those cells. And then, because of the antibodies have a property called ADCC, antibody-dependent cellular cytotoxicity, those cells are marked for elimination. So we want to see if the combination of the two or just one eradicates or decrease the size of the reservoir. And how do we test if that has happened? Is we do a lot of measurements during this period of time, but the key method is to stop antiretroviral therapy when there is nothing in the system. And we follow people for 16 weeks, for 24 weeks, up to 24 weeks. And then if the viral load goes over 1,000 copies for 4 weeks, then we restart medications. If it doesn't go, and it turns out that this strategy allows for people to stay off antiretroviral therapy for a long time, we continue to follow the patients in another study that we'll talk about later. So for post-intervention controllers. So this is one of the studies. The study is open, has enrolled people, but it's still open to screen more potential participants. And it's a relatively small study, okay? KICK is the IL-15 superagonist, which also has other properties like boosting immunity, a drug that has been developed for cancer treatment as a booster for immune responses against cancer cells. And then the treatment, which is the combination of broadly neutralizing antibodies. That's one of the studies. This is another study that, as Luis said, we have a lot of interest in looking at how we can use the monoclonal antibodies in strategies for cure. And this is a study that is asking the question, if you give the antibodies at the same time that you start antiretroviral therapy, when people are being diagnosed with acute infection, will you decrease the size of the reservoir? Will you change the balance and decrease the size of the HIV reservoir so that people, when you stop therapy, after doing this for 2 years, that they will not rebound, that you have switched the immune system in a way that will be able to control the HIV virus in the absence of antiretroviral therapy. So we are looking for patients that have acute HIV infection. We don't see very many of those, but in the ACTG as a network, we have been able to find around, when we did this for 1.5 years, around 200 people that had acute infection. And then we give medicine immediately, is provided. We give the most popular medication regimen right now, is Biktarvy, with or without an antibody. And we follow the people. Most people will become undetectable after this. And the question the study is asking is, if you give an antibody at the same time that you start antiretroviral therapy, do you have an effect on the reservoir? And then there is a big theory about the antibodies bind to free virus, and those are immunogenic and improve the immune response against the HIV virus. So that does binding make it for the patients more likely to control HIV in the absence of antiretroviral therapy, which is tested during the ATI, which is the second step. And then if people don't rebound, they will be continuing the ATI. If people rebound over 1,000 copies for 4 weeks, which is now the way we do treatment interruptions, they will be started on antiretroviral therapy and yes, they will be followed. So this is a different question from the first one. There is no kick here. The question is, if we give the antibodies to somebody who's acutely infected, do we affect the reservoir, and do we affect the immune system in a way that will allow people to stay off therapy? That's the second question, second strategy. And this is another study that is going to open probably towards the end of the summer, 5374. And this is a similar study, but for people that were already treated during acute infection. These 200 people that we found in our previous trial that are being suppressed on antiretroviral therapy after taking antiretroviral medication. And the question the study is, these people, as Luis said before, they have a smaller reservoir. So can we do something to target that reservoir to do the same thing, to see if they can control the virus in the absence of therapy? And here we are throwing the kitchen sink, literally the kitchen sink here. So people get a vaccine, is a T-cell vaccine, which is a vaccine that is going to boost the T-cell section group of the immune system. They get a Besatolimab, which is a latency reversing agent. So this is the kick in this approach. Remember, the participants in this study will be suppressed, and they are getting the kick, and they are getting 2 broadly neutralizing antibodies. We talk about them, plus a T-cell vaccine. So they are getting the kick and 2 kills, the T-cell kill and the antibody kill. And the idea is that by combining these 3, we will see if after 1 year of doing that, when all the antibodies are out of the system, if that prolongs the treatment interruption, if the participants can control the virus in the absence of therapy. Because many people that are infected, some people that are infected, acutely infected, and were treated initially, they have a delayed rebound. There is a control group that received the injection, but is a placebo arm. There has been a lot of discussion in our community advisory board about if it's okay to get placebo or not okay. It is a 2-to-1, so more people get the antibodies, the T-cell vaccine, and the bosutinib, but there's still a placebo arm. And we decided that it was reasonable because we don't know how many people are going to control on their own. But this is something that I think if the study enroll slowly, I think this is a big barrier for the community, the placebo arm. I think the team might rethink the need for the placebo arm. Anyway, different question. People that were treated during acute infection, we throw the kitchen sink. But T-cell vaccine, 2 antibodies, and a latency reversing agent. And the last study that I'm going to show is people, this is for they were treated during the acute infection, similar to the other one, but they are just getting antibodies before the treatment interruption. Instead of the kitchen sink, they get antibodies during the treatment interruption. So these are for patients that started treatment during acute HIV infection. They have a smaller reservoir. They have been undetectable for 2 years. They get 2 antibodies or not before starting an analytical treatment interruption. The design has been changed, so there is no placebo arm. So everybody gets the same thing, and everybody stops the analytical treatment interruption after the infusion of the antibody. So it's a little bit simpler than is shown in this graphic, but I couldn't find a recent graphic of the study. This study will open also in September. And finally, what do we do with patients, or the participants that after all these things that we are trying to do, they don't rebound? How do we follow them? And that's because we're going to have to monitor them closely, because we want to make sure that it is safe to be off antiretroviral therapy, and we need to understand if that control is the same as being controlled with medicines. So we have an observational post-intervention control. So anybody that participates in any ACTG study, multiple studies that have an intervention and do not rebound, after 6 months, that's a post-intervention controller. Go into this study, we monitor them every 4 weeks with viral loads, CD4 cell counts, we do safety labs, and we want to understand what is the mechanism that some people are capable of controlling the HIV virus in the absence of therapy. So there is a leukapheresis, rectal biopsies, those procedures are optional and we follow them. And then if they rebound, we restart therapy and we follow them for a year to see if the prolonged treatment interruption has had an effect on the reservoir or the inflammatory markers in these participants. And these are the studies that we are opening in the next few months. Some of them are already open, and I will be more than happy to take any questions about these studies or clarify any about this. And there is a very close collaboration between our unit and the BITCO laboratory. Many of the potential treatment ideas that the BITCO laboratories are developing are going to be tested in the ACTG. So the connection between the BITCO laboratories and the ACTG as a work group is only going to expand in the next few years. So you will see many of those ideas being crystallized in ACTG clinical trials. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pablo. So we'll take any questions on the agenda, on the study designs, or before we move on to Ken.
So it looks like at this time, we don't have any questions.
All right, thank you. So Ken?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ken, and I'm the boots on the ground type of person who interacts with the community and the doctors and the researchers in order to make sure everyone is on the same page. And we continually have a flow of motivated people from the community who understand what we're trying to achieve so that they can buy in to sometimes very complex processes, as has been laid out by Dr. Tabas and Dr. Montaner. Every time I come on to one of these talks, I learn something and I work with it every day. So if you're feeling a little overwhelmed right now by everything that was presented, then you're in a good place. It's my job when you reach out to become involved in these trials to help you better understand the science and the complex slides that you just saw. So I like to use this as this impression as a wagon wheel. And the center of the wagon wheel is Philadelphia. And Philadelphia is a big hub for HIV research. And within that hub is the University of Pennsylvania, with the Wistar Institute, is Philadelphia Fight, myself, and the community at large. So we're the center of that wheel. You take that wheel away and what's going to happen? The wheel will collapse. So the center has to be your first thing. And then the individual spokes of that wheel are all the corresponding collaborating labs around the world. So we're not just doing this locally. If you participate, a little piece of you gets to see the world. You get to go to Europe, you get to go to Canada, you get to go all over the United States, because we're using experts in each one of these steps that have been discussed to work on individual components and come together, which is what the definition of a collaboratory is. We are no longer covering our paper and each lab working independently on its own idea. We are kumbaya, coming together with fellow researchers and coming together for a bigger idea and then splitting that work. And then on the outside of the wagon wheel is the continuous communication, whether it be through meetings like this or webinars that we do or email exchanges, reports, publications, and that pulls everybody together. So that involves the regulatory government folks, making sure we're keeping everybody safe. That's peer-reviewed articles, making sure that everything has been well laid out and thought out, that it's good science. And that is what we're doing here in Philadelphia. And we need people, patients, who trust in the concept of science and trust that their safety is the #1 aspect of all this work. So these projects are always laid out, maximizing the safety of everyone involved. So if I had to rank it, safety, science. Your safety is well and far away better, more important than any science. And so that's why these things are designed, and nurses and doctors are in place to ensure your safety. So we can't do this without you, the community. Otherwise, we're just a bunch of talking heads with a lot of good ideas that we can't prove because we don't have any participants offering blood or tissue or anything, saliva. So we can come up with ideas and then prove our ideas, so that then those basic science ideas, which was Dr. Montaner's portion, can eventually go into Dr. Tabas's world, where it actually becomes a clinical trial. So it's a spectrum, and it starts with an idea, and then we motivate people to participate in giving us samples to prove the idea, and then hopefully a various type of clinical trial that helps us real world present the idea. So a couple terms have been used throughout this. ATI, which is an analytical treatment interruption. ATI is a big buzzword. It means that you're stopping your life-saving HIV medications. And this, when you're thinking about a cure, is absolutely imperative, because how can we evaluate if our interventions have changed anything if the virus is being suppressed by the already designed HIV medications? So in the world of HIV cure, ATI comes hand in hand with that concept. And it's done, as it states, very analytically, very structured, followed safety. But even with that, it's a hard pill to swallow, forgive the pun, that you were to stop your medications in order for a betterment of us all. But we have to think the people who came before us and the steps that they took to bring us to the point for 1 or 2 pills a day, or now we have injectables that are once every 2 months. It's staggering in the 25 years to see the 25, 30, 40 years to see the growth that we had. And that, again, all comes back to community trust, community participation. We're really hoping today's talk just gives folks hope to know that there's some very talented, smart people who have dedicated their lives to working in research. No one really ever gets rich in research. You can get rich in the medical world in very different ways, delivering clinical care. But if you choose research, that tells you something about that person and what they prioritize in their lives. So we have a lot of dedicated people who have chosen research. And every day we wake up trying to answer questions. A question that we answer spawns 2 more questions. Those 2 questions spawn 4 more questions. And that is what research is about. And again, we can't do any of that without the trust and participation of our folks. So if you're interested in getting involved, my name and number was on one of the slides earlier on. Again, Ken Lin, my cell phone, 215-432-6871. Please speak slowly when leaving a message so I can get back to you. And the slide also had my email address. I would also direct folks to our beat dash, not underscore, but a dash HIV.org, O-R-G. And that has a huge amount of information about what we've done, what we're doing, and what we hope to do. And on the left side, it says getting involved. How can I get involved? You can click on a button and enter some information there, and that also will come to me and will get you involved. Involved could be sitting on a committee. Involved could be giving a one-time blood specimen. Involved could be giving multiple blood specimens. Involved could be a clinical trial that lasts a year plus. So there's a huge spectrum of getting involved, and we can't be effective and successful if we don't have a motivated and trusting community. So please reach out. I'd love to have an individual conversation. It's very difficult to get into the me type questions that sometimes come up on these calls. But as a registered nurse, everything we speak about would be covered by HIPAA with all privacy and respect given. So I would welcome some outreach, and I would be able to demystify anything that maybe been confusing for you on the call so far today. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Ken. So we can proceed with Danielle.
Thank you, Dr. Montaner. Thank you, Dr. Tebas, Ken, and everybody who's taken time out of their busy schedule to join today's conversation. I'm here on behalf of community. You all have heard the name dropped and utilized as part of most of the discussions today. Outside of, Dr. Montaner, Dr. Tebas's, stellar background presentations on the science. But I wanted to take a moment to ground the conversation to say that none of these scientific advances would be possible without the altruistic and beneficent motivations of communities to dedicate their time, their love, and literally their bodies to this work. But I wanted to ground the conversation from the community perspective to highlight what we call underrepresentedness in cure research. And I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to ground the discussion with some numbers to offer some perspective. So the promise of a cure could benefit the lives of about 38 million people who are living with HIV globally. However, the science and its beauty and grace falls short in incorporating all people affected by HIV who could stand to benefit from access to an HIV cure if and when it becomes available. So we want to take care from the community perspective to right that wrong from the outset, and how we address some of those gaps in representation is first by naming. We have to name that there is an issue of lack of representativeness in HIV cure research. So just a bit of background on some of the numbers. On the left, you see a diagram that describes HIV incidence by race and ethnicity in the US. So Black or African-American people comprise 41% of people living with HIV, even though we're only 13% of the US population. 38 million people globally are living with HIV, the majority of which are women. So keep those numbers in mind as we further have this conversation and highlight and underscore the need to have reflectiveness as part of these studies. So I mentioned Black people and I mentioned women. Those two groups of folks are underrepresented in these trials. And so as I mentioned at the top of this talk, HIV cure research lacks the diversity across, the earliest stages of protocol development. And that diversity, it starts at the top when you talk about the racial reflectiveness of investigators, study staff, and it goes all the way to, it shows up in a way that we see a lack of reflectiveness in the representation of people who participate in trials. And so this fabulous group of folks called the AIDS Treatment Activist Coalition took it upon themselves to unpack how race and gender are captured in some of these studies. And they notated a lot of discrepancies that we can work as a field of HIV professionals and community folks to create what we call equity in some of these conversations. So we know, and if you don't, I'm going to tell you now that HIV cure research must include all people affected by HIV, taking care to give special attention to those individuals that I described at the top of the talk: Black Black people and women, right? Those folks need to be centered in some of these conversations around cure, given that they bear the disproportionate burden of HIV. And so I learned about this universal declaration that I've described here on the screen that says the benefit of scientific progress should be afforded to all people. But if we know that there's a fundamental lack of representation of all people affected by HIV and cure research, we should ask ourselves, if and when a cure comes, will those individuals most disproportionately impacted by HIV have the benefit of access to this cure? So there were a couple of studies that were conducted, and I wanted to share them here with you that further unpack what these disparities in HIV-related clinical research look like. So not only to describe the problem, but we must frame the problem as a public health issue. Not only is HIV a public health issue, but the lack of research justice and equitable representation of people affected by HIV in these trials is also a concern of research-related justice that we must address and unpack. So here are two great studies by Carly Roberts and Liz Barr and folks that take the opportunity to unpack this issue of underrepresentedness in HIV cure research. So I did want to take a note or take a moment to give a nod to the importance of the role of community in HIV cure related research. And so this slide comes to us as courtesy of the curriculum. And so the curriculum is a 6-module, it's a 6-module fantastic teaching and learning tool that was prepared by community to educate other key stakeholders, community investigators, lay folks on different aspects of HIV cure related research. And so there's a specific module within that describes the ethical implications of HIV cure related research. And so I borrowed this slide from that to contextualize how important it is to have community involved at every step of the development of some of these rather complex studies. So you heard Lynn and Dr. Montaner and Dr. Tebas talk about analytic treatment interruptions. Well, there are certain ethical implications that should be considered as a part of community participating in those types of trials. And so as a matter of good participatory practice, it says, and we say as community, that we should be involved in this work from its conception to its implementation, not merely presented with the protocol once the idea has been concretized amongst a group of researchers that are far removed from the lived experiences of individual community members affected by HIV. So we have a framework of guidance that says, here's how you present these studies to highly affected communities in an evidence-based way, because that's something that researchers will key into. Is it evidence-based? Well, absolutely. And we've provided the framework here. So we wanted to highlight the incredible history of community participation in HIV research. So community has a historical legacy of participating in these types of research. And in doing so, we provide voice and we provide perspective that isn't necessarily that of the folks who are hard at work to find a cure. So we want to always be grounded and centered in our collaborative approaches and highlight community's partnership, right? We are partners in this research. And so the Denver Principles is one of the earliest defined community efforts to engage the HIV research industrial complex in fighting for or bringing to the fold some of the rights that should be afforded to people living with HIV and other communities of folks who are affected by HIV, who desire to participate in some of these clinical research processes. And so, you know, all the way coming to you hot from 1983, these principles still have relevance in some of, or in all of the HIV cure related considerations that we see and have discussed as part of today's conversation. So what do we as communities say? You've heard from the researchers, you've heard from their staff who are responsible for implementing some of the research studies. What do we say as community? We say, and I'm highlighting it here on the slide, so there's no more question about what community says, thinks, or feels. We say that HIV cure research should be reflective and include all people affected by HIV. So if the epidemic is 50% women, 50% Black people, depending upon where you are, if it's centered in low and middle income resource context, then those individuals should be included in and leading HIV cure related research. It should be ethical. It should consider the lived experiences of those individuals who could stand to benefit from an HIV cure. And last, but most certainly not least, it should involve community from its earliest stages of development. And with that said, I'll take a moment to highlight the BEAT HIV Collaboratory Community Advisory Board. So our chair, Will Carter, our secretary and all around good guy, Reese Maddox, and then on the right, in the upper slide, you'll see, you know, the vast representation of folks who are committed to joining in and supporting the research efforts at the BEAT and beyond. And then just below that, there's a picture of our community and our vision. And our vision is a world where HIV and AIDS research meaningfully involves impacted communities. It's collaboratively created and openly shared. So a quick nod to Lynn, if you are interested in participating in research or getting involved in the community fight to further this work and increase information into communities most affected by HIV, please take a moment to join us. I'll leave my contact information in the chat and I'll stop there. And just, you know, I wouldn't be a public health professional if I didn't remind you that this is what we're striving for, liberation. Liberation creates a platform for all people to be meaningfully engaged in this work. This is our envisioned reality as community members in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. So we can sort of proceed to just questions that may have. There's a couple of questions that were posted. So
All like me to read them, or would you like to read them and answer them on your own?
thank you. Yeah, I'll go ahead and read them and direct them. Thank you. So Pablo, the first question I'll give to you, which is what is the functional application of a placebo arm concept, and why there may not be a need for one?
Well, I mean, placebos are needed sometimes when you don't know what happens when you stop therapy and in a particular population. In this particular population, because they were treated when they were acutely they were treated very, very early. So they already have a very small HIV reservoir. So some people that were treated very early control HIV in the absence of antiretroviral therapy when you stop therapy. It's more common in African women. So that was tested in a clinical trial in Africa called PROMISE. So women were treated during pregnancy and then they stopped therapy. 15% of the women that were treated during pregnancy that were recently infected, they didn't rebound. So that's why when you do trials, sometimes you need to have a placebo arm. I am not a big fan of placebo arms because I know that most people rebound. And I think if you put a threshold, you say, I'm going to pursue this intervention if 30% of the people do not rebound. And if it's less than that, I really don't care. But in this, there was a long discussion about this particular design. And finally, the group, the ACTG as a group, settled with the need of a placebo arm. But as you can see, there is two participants randomized to the 3 interventions, the T-cell vaccine, the antibodies, and the latency reversing agent, and 1 participant randomized to the other. Many trials have shown that sometimes when you break the blinding, you have the control in the arm that didn't get the intervention. So that's why you need a comparator. But nobody feels easy when with a placebo comparator.
And then
I would add on to that. This kind of lends to Danielle's discussion with regards to ethical, because if this isn't fully explained to a participant, it could be perceived incorrectly why someone may be on an ATI and not getting all of the interventions that the study has. And
I agree, but ethical is a very loaded word. This has been discussed with the community. I mean, this study, I mean, we don't, as a group, we don't propose studies without discussing with the community, and the community members, not unanimously, obviously there is never unanimity in this kind of thing, but it agrees that in this particular study, there is a reason to include a placebo arm. If you have realized the other 3 or 4 studies I have presented, there is no placebo arm. So sometimes it's necessary. The investigators and the community members that were part of this study thought it was necessary in this study. Not everybody agrees with that, but obviously people, if they don't want, they don't need to participate. Obviously, they shouldn't participate. But in general, we try to clearly think twice before including a completely.
Yeah, ATI, even beyond the aspect of the extra arm, these individuals, this is not happening within a laboratory. This is happening within the community. So we constantly are refreshing and bringing it front stage for participants that an ATI is controlled from a safety standpoint, but it has whole thing of implications with regards to potential exposure of people while you're on this trial and the importance of safe practices while that is, while you're doing something very altruistic for a study, you need to be thinking about, who you're potentially exposing while you're doing it and taking precautions.
So I think that the placebo question has been, moved around discussing multiple settings. And I think that the main rationale, as already stated, is that there are some individuals that suppress already if you were to stop the antiretroviral therapy. So without a placebo arm, you may get a misconception of what may be the effect of the strategy, when in reality, the individual would have had that outcome anyway. And I think that that is, from one side, if I'm sure that everyone in the community wants to have a strategy that actually would be expected to work. And this is one design and studies that could try to address that. Now, the other side has already been noted, is that if you're in a placebo arm, then you're not getting any of the interventions. So participants may not really welcome that relative to the reason that they even approach to be on a studies, because they would like to have the opportunity to do something in addition to what they're doing. So it's a point of a lot of debate, and the debate continues. There's another question regarding the representation of transgender people in studies, and whether there is, I guess I'll start with you, Ken, is when an individual that is transgender approaches you to be in a study, what, at least locally, where has that discussion led? And then we'll go to a broader kind of representation on a more broad basis.
A potential participant who is transgendered is approached and treated the same as anyone else. There's no limitations on entry into our projects, and we welcome a more diverse as we possibly can. In our most recent 3 trials, we have had transgender represented. Now, it's not represented to the percentage that I believe that it is in the community. Similar to women, we have women in our trials, and we take all kinds of efforts to reach out to these communities, transgendered women. For us, African American hasn't been an issue to date. We have a strong representation in that community for our local trials, but all are welcome.
So Pablo, do you have any comments regarding the ACTG and transgender persons?
No, in general, there is no exclusion. I mean, all genders are included in clinical trials, except some studies that are specific. So some studies require male sex or female sex because they are specific for those questions. But in general, most of the studies, or I would say 99% of the studies, includes all genders. So nobody's excluded because of being transgender. It's a population that is very important to study more. Generally, they are a little bit disenfranchised and they don't have less access to trials. But as Ken said, we try to, I mean, we have had representation with transgenders in all the studies that we have done. So we don't exclude anybody from participating.
In the 14 years that I have been leading up the clinical tasks in Beat HIV, we have never had an exclusion of a transgender. Everyone who came and screened ultimately went through to participate.
It is rare trials that you want to have males or females, and trans might be excluded in those studies. Not always, sometimes it is allowed. For example, when you're studying the menstrual cycle or something like that, but that's a very rare study. So usually there is no limitation.
Thank you. Any other questions on the chat? I mean, on the question and answer?
All right, at this time, there are no more questions. We can give everyone 1 more minute to see if there are any more questions or if you'd like to say anything to our wonderful panelists. So let's take a minute.
I just hope next year is in the flesh. Although this is comfortable and easy to do. I was recently in the ACTG meeting in Washington, and really it's very nice to see people 3D and interact face to face. So I hope for next year this meeting is not a virtual meeting, and we are back to some sort of normalcy, because I think it's much more interactive. So anyway,
Amen to that.
Dr. Tabas.
but
I agree with you completely. We do have a thank you all for attending our session today. Oh, that was Danielle.
Showing thanks for everybody who took time out to hear our very critical conversation.
And I hope that everyone got the main message that you, the community, are central to effective, responsible, and successful
Ethical.
research and ethical research, and that you know who to contact. My information is in the chats. My information is on the slides. You may not be getting me direct. You may not be working with me directly, but I will put you in touch with a variety of networks throughout Philadelphia Fight and the University of Pennsylvania. And there are a plethora of ways to be a participant. And then finally, your safety far and away is number one. Research is a far and away lower number two. That when you come on board, you are not signing away your interests. Your interests are front and center in all research.
And I'm just going to close by inviting you all again to the Jonathan Lax lecture on June 28th. It's coming up. We have the lead of the Gates Foundation HIV cure research presenting their vision for a cure with a global impact. So I think it would be a really exciting lecture, an opportunity to learn from one of the leading funders of HIV cure directed research. So I invite you to register at wistar.org. The wistar.org site has a link for registration under the Jonathan Lax under events. So please check that out, and thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Montaner. And Danielle is currently Zooming with us from South Africa. That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us virtually.
Absolutely. So I was grateful for the virtual opportunity to attend.
Yeah, and thank you to our panelists for your thoughtful and insightful presentation. And thank you to all of our viewers for joining us today. Please join us for all of our upcoming presentations. Thank you, take care, be safe and well, and have a wonderful day.
Have a great day, everybody.